One of the pieces that I talked about in my grad program a lot, and one of the pieces that we continue to kind of engage in dialogue about is the perspective that a piece of software has. So any application that you use has a particular ideology, right? Like someone wrote it, someone has made decisions about how you ought to use it. And one of the things that's interesting about TouchDesigner, one of the reasons we keep using it, is that some of those decisions aren't made for you. So you are really put in a position to decide how you want a system to operate or how you want an installation or experience to kind of unfold.
Welcome to another episode of Tech in the Arts, the podcast series of the Arts Management and Technology Laboratory. The goal of our podcast series is to exchange ideas, bring awareness, and stay on top of the trends. You're listening to our Art and Code podcast series, highlighting artists working at the intersection of performance, real-time visuals, and live coding. This series is in partnership with the Frank Ratchey Studio for Creative Inquiry at Carnegie Mellon University. My name is Hannah Brainard, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm the lead researcher for AMTLab. Today I'm joined by Zoey Sandoval and Matthew Ragan, co-founders of SudoMagic, a design and software development studio which focuses on immersive experiences. Zoey and Matthew, thank you so much for joining us today. Just sort of to start things off, could you give a brief overview about some of the immersive technology that you use and how it became a part of your artistic practice, professional life, and some of the work that you do today?
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, it's wonderful to be here.
Yeah, it's super exciting to be here. So SudoMagic, we started SudoMagic a few years ago, actually during the pandemic.
Right before
it happened in February of 2020, which was, at the time we didn't realize what was going on. But we were actually super fortunate that we had work all throughout the pandemic. Folks were still kind of interested, even though we couldn't really go into some, physical spaces, we still had work in the kind of immersive arts and technology space, which was really great.
It was incredible. And it was interesting to see that companies use that time to kind of take the space to change from their interior spaces or plan some other ideas and kind of use that empty space to do that kind of infrastructural change, which was great.
Right.
In some weird, strange turn in the universe.
Yeah, and we come from slightly different but adjacent backgrounds. My background is in filmmaking. I did documentary work at UCLA, and then I got kind of shown some interactive participatory work, and I was like, oh, that's really cool, that's really interesting. I love the idea of audiences being able to tell their own stories, to be able to be kind of participants in the work. And so I kind of started to veer into the world of theater because that has had more participatory action, and that's actually how I met Matt. Matt has a background in theater.
Yeah, I was an actor, dancer, circus performer once upon a time in what feels like another life. I was working in an educational outreach program in the Northeast in Keene, New Hampshire, and then actually started a grad program at ASU, and that was kind of the big transition for me to start thinking about how to leverage some of the creative technologies that I was using inside of performance. And then eventually that morphed into immersive experiences and themed entertainment.
Wow. There are all sorts of ways to kind of get into this work. That's really amazing.
Yeah, ours was like film and then theater, and then we actually met at a conference that was about arts and technology. Okay. And I was like, oh, there are other people doing this work. This was back in 2015, which was really fun. And then we kind of kept intersecting paths, and we were like, we should start a company. We should do it.
Yeah.
And then it happened. So I imagine, even since 2015, some of the technology has changed a little bit. What's some of the go-to software and hardware that you use in your work?
So funny enough, we actually met because of the software that we still use today, because at the time, not a lot of people were using it. It's way more popular now. It's called TouchDesigner. It's a real-time rendering environment. It's kind of like a Swiss Army knife of softwares. You can have connections to other softwares really easily, and it's really great for kind of real-time effects. And so I was really curious about it because it was a visual programming environment. It's kind of a node-based environment, and my background was in film. A lot of family that I have are actually engineers, but I decided to kind of go a different route. So I have done coding before, but that was really great for me because it was visual. And then Matt was actually at this conference and using the software, and that's still one of the tools that we use today.
So when I was in graduate school, I was using processing, Maximus P, Quartz Composer once upon a time when that was still a thing that existed, Isadora, and trying to find kind of a toolkit that was going to work well for me. Unity hadn't quite emerged on the market yet, and neither had Unreal. Unreal was kind of like just on the fringe, and TouchDesigner kind of well fit a lot of the kind of use cases that we needed. It's interesting. I think one of the pieces that I talked about in my grad program a lot, and one of the pieces that we continue to kind of engage in dialogue about is the perspective that a piece of software has. So like, any application that you use has a particular ideology, right? Like someone wrote it, someone has made decisions about how you ought to use it. And one of the things that's interesting about TouchDesigner, one of the reasons we keep using it, is that some of those decisions aren't made for you. So you are really put in a position to decide how you want a system to operate or how you want an installation or experience to kind of unfold.
Yeah, and besides that, we do a lot of work using Python. We do some web-based work, and that kind of changes depending on the project. In terms of creative design tools, we've used largely the Adobe suite, but recently we've transitioned to using Figma a lot too, just because it's super easy to translate into kind of web platforms and web frameworks. And then for our 3D modeling work, we still have been using Blender a lot.
Yeah. In cloud infrastructure land, we use a lot of AWS services these days. That's still kind of, part and parcel for how we do lots of things on the web. And then, for sensors, it really depends on what project we're working on. We do a lot of prototyping with things like the Connect or the Leap. But when we go to deploy something out in the world that, might be a different piece of hardware that we actually end up using. We've used ousters, we've used kind of just traditional camera-based systems. So it really depends on what project we're working on.
Kind of jumping off of that, could you tell us about some of the recent projects that you've worked on that you were excited about?
Yeah, we've worked on a couple interesting projects recently. I think one of the ones that's been really kind of top of mind for us lately was a project called Visions 2030. That was a kind of exciting project that we got to participate in that was on the campus of CalArts. And then we used that as a launching point for one of our own kind of creative projects called Calaveras, which has been really fun to work on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was, I feel like this year was really fun because we got to do more creative projects versus previous years. We were kind of grinding really hard. I mean, the first few years of our business, we were like, oh my God, we started a company, so we were saying yes a lot, which sometimes, it is better to say no because you don't have enough time to do your own creative work. And so it was great this year because we could do projects that were more creatively fulfilling. Like Matt said, we did the Earth Edition Festival that was by Visions 2030, and that was a festival on kind of sustainability, thinking about eco-conscious futures. That was a really interesting project because it was one of the first times we used image generation techniques using Stable Diffusion, which we in the past have had kind of mixed feelings about. But that was a really lovely experience because we got to see people's visions of the future, like what they would imagine an ecological, sustainable future would look like. So that was really amazing. And then that kind of, like Matt said, brought us into the project that we did most recently, which is called Calaveras. This is not a sugar skull. And that was kind of coming off of a trip from Mexico City. It was also the Day of the Dead, right around that time. And we were doing this AI project. So it was like all these three things kind of came together to create this kind of conversation piece that's in conversation with Magritte's The Treachery of Images. So, this is not a pipe. This is not a sugar skull. They were all AI generated. These weren't actually, sugar skulls. They were these kind of, like Matt likes to, the machine hallucinations.
Right, a machine's hallucination of what a sugar skull might look like. And so, I think we've been, I don't know the right word there. I think that I especially feel like I have a distrust of some of the kind of current trends in the use of machine learning and AI. And so it was a great opportunity to kind of take a step back and think creatively about how we could use some of those tools without being quite so cynical about them.
Oh, that's really interesting. We'll have to tag some links to go view this in
Mm-hmm.
with the podcast because just looking at some of the work, it's beautiful and impactful, and you can see pieces of you in the work that you do. It's interesting that you bring up your Visions 2030 project because that is one that I really wanted to dive in a little bit further. So as you were setting up this project, how did you consider how the user would like take part in this experience? What were some of the conversations you had about how to make it maybe more impactful in terms of sustainability?
That one was really an interesting project because we were pulled on a little bit later in the process. So there was kind of some already planning and kind of thoughts around the whole the experience of the festival, because it was part of a larger festival, and our section was like these 3 domes. So imagine there were domes that had projection in them, there were domes that had
a digital campfire
idea, and then our dome was the last one. So you would go through this first dome and you kind of get a primer about what the intentions are for the experience, thinking about and meditating on if you could imagine an ecological, sustainable future, what would that look like? The second dome was this kind of full immersive projection where you really were like kind of,
embraced in this psychedelic journey of
consciousness and thinking about, sustainable futures. And then you came out into the third dome, which was our experience, and that was kind of a reflection point. So it was kind of like you were being guided through the first 2 experiences as a primer for the kind of ethos of the festival. And then in the third experience, we got to invite folks to submit their own visions for the gallery.
The future that they wanted to imagine. The interesting kind of piece about that kind of 3-dome story experience is that users, visitors, it's a strange paradigm to try and think about, left the dome experience, and then were kind of guided out to where they could have conversations with other mentors talking about sustainability and how to take some of the ideas that they had formed in that 3-stage experience and then actualize them in some way.
Yeah, so we were kind of like the culminating point for that meditation visioning experience, and what we really had to think about was how do we have folks submit their visions of the future and make sure that we are creating the images that we want, especially because we had to think about they were bringing a lot of high school and middle school kids to this festival as part of just field trips and things like that. And so we had to think a lot about content curation because, you give a mouse a cookie and they'll run wild. Mm-hmm. And so we had to think of different ways to create either we were thinking, could this be like a Mad Lib style? So we'll form the prompt and they could pick certain words. And then we were like, maybe they'll pick certain words that they shouldn't pick. And then we're like, okay, what about a word bank kind of selection? And so we ended up, in conjunction with Visions 2030 and with their partners, coming up with a series of themes. And so you would go through the user experience of giving your vision by picking themes surrounding what kind of communities do you imagine, what kind of structures do you imagine in these communities. So what do the buildings or what do the kind of the places that we live in look like? What is the environment? Are we in an arid environment? Is it a jungle? Are there waterfalls? And then also what kind of technological solutions? Because they did want to think about, how can we, use technology for good? How can we think about pushing more, kind of clean energy technologies? And then at the end, they were allowed to pick an aesthetic, right? Mm-hmm. Which was interesting because that allowed us to give a bit more visual curation.
Yeah, we used that particular prompt to do an image-to-image translation, so that ensured that we create a kind of thematic through line through all of the images that were curated and created. The experience itself was you would kind of come into this large dome environment, and there was a set of 9 screens on the outside of this kind of circular structure, and then another 9 screens on the inside. And the images as they were generated would go kind of full screen in this 80-inch vertical portrait style monitor. So you'd see your vision kind of in high def, and then it would wrap back around behind to a gallery on the inside. So there was kind of 2 moments where you saw one big image, and then you saw the image in conversation with all the other images that were generated by all the participants. I think one of the really interesting challenges there was that we the conversations we had both with the creative studio that we worked with and with the Visions 2030 team was around the kind of guarding against the impulse to just let someone kind of respond wildly from a free form to a prompt. If you've done any image generation, one of the challenges there is that sometimes more isn't always better. Sometimes it's really about the conciseness of what you're trying to communicate. And so a lot of our efforts really went into thinking about how do we form and structure that prompt in a way that's going to produce consistent and compelling images, and not necessarily something that's just like wildly kind of like both A, inconsistent, and B, containing material that might not be conducive to an environment that is intended for families.
Right. Wow, it sounds like you found a really impactful way to help people tell part of their own story, but maintaining kind of a cohesive story through the project. Zoey, I wanted to ask you, in the past, you worked with UCLA Center for Research in Engineering, Media, and Performance, working particularly with storytelling initiatives. So could you tell me a little bit more why storytelling is important to you, and how you've used it to tell some of your personal story?
Yeah, so I was exposed to Remap while I was in my undergrad, and then they had gotten a grant from Google to look at the future of storytelling. And at the time, we were given Google Glass, and were given the opportunity to explore different ways to use Glass for narrative and storytelling purposes. And that was really interesting because we all got to kind of pitch different ideas. And one of the projects that we ended up doing was using Google Glass as a way to do kind of like a live improv performance. And so actors would wear Google Glass, and then the director would, using sentiment analysis, kind of guide what they should say based off of the kind of affect. And so it was within the scene, so the director wasn't really intervening verbally, but using kind of like an iPad interface, they would tell them to, be more antagonistic or be more soft and delicate, and then giving them sometimes specific things to say. So I feel like my opportunity working with Remap was incredible because I was exploring different ways to experiment with storytelling, and I've always just appreciated the ability to create interactive storytelling environments because then more folks can tell their stories. While I was at UCLA, I did a documentary undergrad focus, so I've always loved kind of doing work that's centered around real people's stories. Even though I love magical realism and fantasy and bright colors, I've always been more drawn to real people's stories. And so while I was there, I did a documentary on my grandparents' immigration to the United States from Mexico, which was really nice because I got to shoot it on 16 millimeter film. We were like the last class that they had do that, and the last class where we got to use the film editing beds. So that was really amazing. And then in my MFA, I also did work exploring my grandfather's archive on my Venezuelan side. So he was a photojournalist in Venezuela, and for a long time I knew there was an archive of photographs, but I think my dad was hesitant. I don't know. There were all film negatives, so he was very wary of anyone touching them and opening in them. But eventually I kind of convinced him. I was like, come on, it's time. I want to see them. And so we went through a process of scanning thousands, tens of thousands of negatives. And I used that as the basis for my thesis, which was an immersive environment, kind of a love letter to Venezuela, to Venezuelan diaspora, thinking about places that we can no longer return to, thinking about kind of memory, love, and longing. And so, yeah, I've always, been really passionate about sharing those kind of personal stories, sharing intergenerational kind of stories. I think it's super valuable. Stories are the ways that we connect, as part of the human experience. So, I just love it.
That's really beautiful. Matthew, sort of switching gears. So prior to working with SudoMagic, you were part of the software team with Obscura Digital, which was later obtained by Madison Square Garden, and you worked with Sphere Project, that's correct?
Yeah, I
Could
did.
you say a little bit more about your experience there and maybe some of the differences working with a large company like that versus kind of working at your own company now?
Yeah, definitely. It was interesting. I joined Obscura Digital as an interactive engineer, so I was a code monkey building the infrastructure that drove a lot of our experiences and installations. And in the transition to Madison Square Garden, part of the kind of arc of that was trying to understand what that venue was going to need, what ideal kind of software tooling and kind of perspectives that you might kind of embed inside of a studio that was going to stand up an experience like that. I actually worked at MSG as the director of real-time content generation. And so my team was really focused on how to think about using real-time tools and environments to generate content that was going to be on the exterior and interior screens for MSG Sphere. And I don't know how much of that kind of made its way through the whole pipeline, but what was interesting about that is that, in architectural environments and then in any big company, a large part of the conversation that you always have to engage in is really educational about why is this important, what's the impact of this tooling and perspective, and why will it be something that's going to be a critical technology to include in this, multi-billion-dollar venue that's being constructed. And I think the interesting part for me there is that a lot of that same kind of education and conversation finds its way into your own studio. A lot of the times we spend working with clients are about trying to tease out what it is that they're trying to create. I mean, sometimes we'll get a brief or a request that say, kind of an SOW that's outlined like it's XYZ, like this is the thing that you're going to build, which is great when that happens. I think more often than not, we really enter into more of a conversation about an idea that someone wants to kind of bring to life. And then part of our job is to try and, tease out, okay, well, does that mean that you need us to build software? Does that mean that we need to assemble off-the-shelf pieces? Like, what is it that you're trying to actually achieve? And then also, if you're trying to achieve something new or really novel or interesting, why is part of the process going to take a long time? Or why do we need to do a phase of research to understand the implications of, this particular decision that we're making? And so I think that kind of education and conversational piece is really similar, being inside of a large organization and then running your own studio space at the same time. There are some big differences also. I think that, we make our own schedules, which is very different than when you work inside of a large organization. And we're also empowered to kind of make choices much more quickly and more nimbly than you might when you're inside of a kind of large organization, which is a blessing and a curse, I suppose, at the same time, right? So really, I think there's a lot of pieces that I gained from working inside of both Obscure Digital and at Madison Square Garden that have carried over as we've started our own studio.
That's great. And it's interesting that you talked about education, because diving into your backgrounds, it seems like education is a piece of everything you do, both in helping students learn how to take part in this, like you're here at Carnegie Mellon this week, but also constantly learning to be able to help serve your clients well. So as you kind of learn about the current environment of technology, you talked about AI earlier. What are some of the emerging technologies that you're excited about, that you're diving into, some that you might be a little more skeptical of?
I feel like AI is one that answers both of those questions in a way, just because for a while, we've been doing work, in our own careers using machine learning and image recognition for a long time, when it was more rudimentary, and then now where it's a lot more accessible. And I think, in the past few years, I've felt a bit of like a feeling of like an ostrich with its head in the sand, because I'm just like, I can't with all of this going on. Like, it's overwhelming. It's the direction that it's going is frightening. It's concerning. But then we were given this opportunity with Visions 2030, and it kind of like gave me a new perspective on it. I'm like, you know what? If we're the people who have the capacity to drive a more creative vision and thinking about, how can we use, I don't even want to, it's not really AI for good, but how can we just think of different ways to use these applications that aren't militarized, that aren't, used in ways to create misinformation. And so it was a really great opportunity. If we're not the people using it, then only some other people will be using it, and then kind of what will happen? It'll continue to veer in a direction that, I find particularly frightening. And so I think image generation is really interesting. I saw some work that was about, there were images of kind of a liberated future, and like what would that look like for a group of people. And it was funny because just last week I was telling Matthew, I was like, my dad was seeing the Calaveras project that we did, and he was like, oh, that's so cool. And he was like, that's amazing. He's like, how'd you do that? And I was like, well, it's actually, no, it's not that hard nowadays. And he was like, oh, that's so cool. He was like, what if we could imagine, he was like thinking about my thesis project. He's like, what if we could imagine Venezuela now, but like as what it used to be. Like, what if we asked people in diaspora, what would they imagine if they could go back? What would it look like to them? And I was like, oh, that's really interesting, you know? I was like, that's really nice, so.
Yeah, I think, to answer your question, I think there's a unavoidable future at this point with the kind of like momentum and trajectory of technology as we start to think about what the impacts of machine learning and AI inside of the tools that we use. I think that there's a lot of really interesting enthusiasm, and it's hard not to be enthusiastic about what that's going to unlock for kind of semantic interaction with computing. I think a lot of the pieces that we're starting to see now really kind of aim us away from screen-based interactions and instead point us towards language-based interactions, which is the future of Star Trek that every 30 and 40-year-old kind of was exposed to on broadcast television. I think the parts that I have the most resistance and skepticism about, having worked with technology now and having been a developer, are kind of appreciating and recognizing that any of these large systems, any AI system, is really at its heart still kind of embedded in some of the surveillance technologies that permeate the web, right? Like we can only have these systems that are predictive because we have extracted so much information from people, either through their email accounts or through their social media accounts and through all of these kinds of transactions and interactions that weren't necessarily consensual. They were consensual in that I clicked the I agree box, you're allowed to collect my data, but there is a part of that feels really disingenuous to me and is also historically tremendously biased towards smaller subsets of the population in terms of who it represents, who it's good for, and who benefits from it. So to me, the kind of techno-utopian fantasy about how we're going to be liberated from our responsibilities through technology kind of turns a blind eye to some of the trends that are necessary for how we reinforce and train these big models and who's represented and who shows up in the images that we generate. So, I think that there's a interesting enthusiasm, but I don't feel like that is necessarily a future that includes everybody. That feels like it's in a future that is like for a subset of the population that isn't necessarily about kind of creating an equal opportunity future. And so I just have a lot of crunchy feelings about that and don't necessarily feel like it is something that I can enthusiastically say like, oh my God, it's going to be so great. Like, well, sure, it's going to be great for some people, but it's not going to be great for everybody.
Yeah, we just got back from Mexico City, and it was really interesting. When we arrived in the United States, you're in the passport, you're in customs, waiting with your passport to like give it to the person. And you arrive up, you get to the desk, and the controller is like, oh, stand in front of this so I can take a picture of you. And you're like, okay, great. So they take a picture of you. And they go, oh, hi. I hadn't even given them my passport yet. I was still holding it. And he goes, hi, Zoey.
Welcome home.
Welcome home. And I was like, sir? Excuse me? And then I was like, what? And then Matt goes through, and they go, hi, Matthew. And then, like, we're leaving. And Matt's like, I was not prepared for them to say my name and say hello to me without me giving them any identification. And so, don't love that. Don't love that. I feel like that's something that's, it's been prevalent for a long time, right? I feel like London is like one of those cities that they say is like, it's a, there's a lot of surveillance generally. And so, yeah, it's that I feel like is concerning, because our freeness, our like in the world is like constantly being surveilled. We know it's prevalent online, but now it's like it's everywhere. It's like, oh geez, okay.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think we've in my graduate school experience, I made a bunch of materials for people to use, other people that want to kind of work their way into this industry, and one of the strange kind of realizations, in the past year and a half since so much kind of like GPT stuff has blown up in the media is kind of reflecting on the fact that I think the audience that I was writing for was other humans, other people, and I so much of the content on the web is now just kind of being swallowed by machines. It's like now, text for machines to be used in other machine processes. And so, I don't know, that part still feels like a little bit weird to me. It feels like it's a less human-centric kind of modality. And I'm just wary.
Right. That's understandable. I mean, it can open doors for new kinds of artistic expression, but at the same time, there's still consideration needed about who has access and what that means, really. Well, thank you so much for taking a little time today. It was great to talk with you. Thanks for being at CMU.
It's really nice.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful campus. The weather is amazing because it's cold. We're from California, and we were like, oh my God, it's cold. This is amazing. So we're super, super happy to be here.
You're the only 2 people in Pittsburgh saying that.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to the Art and Code series on Tech and the Arts. Be on the lookout for new episodes coming to you very soon. If you found this episode informative, educational, or inspirational, be sure to send this to another arts or technology aficionado in your life. You can let us know what you think of this podcast by visiting our website, amtlab.org. That's amt-lab.org, or you can email us at amtlabcmu@gmail.com. Follow us on Instagram at Tech in the Arts or Facebook and LinkedIn at Arts Management and Technology Lab. We'll see you next time.